afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for Agile IT's webinar on line of business application migration and modernization, presented by our CEO, Conrad Aggermont. In the interest of time, I'm going to make this short and sweet, and take it away, Conrad.
All right, thanks, Sean. So really, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this webinar is we get a lot of questions from customers about, you've already made this migration or deployment, whatever way you got to Microsoft 365. You could be in commercial, you could do multi-geo, you could be in GCC high if you're doing US government work and need that. No matter, where, what tenant you're in or deployment, the starting point is we made this investment into Microsoft 365. We're using, so that's kind of the starting point really for this webinar, and your users are in there, Azure Active Directory, whether we're still with local Active Directory, we'll talk about that. And we've moved files, but there's a number of applications that we have from a line of business application perspective. And we really want to look at how do we modernize that, migrate it? Do we migrate in pieces? Do we go all in one? And the starting point that normally happens for most people is a lift and shift. I want to take the things that I have, whether they're on premise in one or multiple locations at our office. We may have it in a co-location. Sometimes you might even have it in another cloud, AWS, or sometimes even in Azure. But we're looking to leverage many of the pieces that we have already in terms of Azure Active Directory for security and multi-factor authentication, and we have these different applications. So how do we, both modernize it and or migrate it if we need to? And the thing is, as we go through this, you don't necessarily have to pick one route for everything. And you don't have to think that I just do it one way and I have to live it like that for a long time. There's different routes, and you should also look at the different applications that you have and start to make decisions one by one. So we look at from a modern desktop, modern devices world, and using what is already there in Microsoft 365 for managing your mobile devices and identity. And you might have the desire to really not have a local Active Directory infrastructure anymore. Some people don't have them, many do. There's a very few amount that might need to keep a local Active Directory, but that's not a scenario we're going to go through much today. But there's still this need of pushing more things off and leveraging more of the investments you've already made for security and compliance, perhaps. Adopted what you're doing in Microsoft 365 in the Office world, Exchange Online, but you're bringing those other applications together for various reasons. And so as we go through this, we'll talk about some high-level pieces. We'll go through some scenarios for specific applications, and we'll make some judgment calls as we go through this. And again, these are really to give you insight or ideas of the different services you can look at, what you should consider when you're trying to look at your applications. And how do we get there? And some of the key drivers that people also go through for this is, there's many times you'll have a variety of business critical applications, and they could be things that you've created yourself. Sometimes those things you created and still manage from 5-10 years ago, and you're managing the code yourself or through a third party. Maybe you purchased it, but even for these different applications that you still may need, they tend to have their own desires of how they log in and how do you manage them and different tools, and it's complex. So how do we make customers are thinking, out in the market, how do I reduce the amount of the kind of vendors and applications and create an improved environment for new people coming into the company or changing, be able to access those applications. If you're out there today, again, the running assumption we'll have through all this is that you're already in Office 365, and people go to myapps.microsoft.com. They can see the applications that are there. They can click on it. I want to expand on that scenario so I get more, to make it easier for people to discover the apps or get access to the applications, really reducing it down versus, lots of custom groups and local AD and all these things. So how do we transition to that? The other part is really around, some of it's around cost, the cost management of it, both in the different, server hardware you might have on-prem. And even here, when I go through the scenarios, sometimes you'll want to keep it there on those local servers and then migrate up if you want, or change some of that. But still, how do we modernize that? But the other really key part is, if you have a number of line of business applications and many of them aren't built into this Microsoft 365 world, but how do I still leverage the security and compliance and data governance, pieces? We're not going to get really deep on the data governance session kind of today, but we might talk about it a bit, and that'll be good for another topic. But using something like Microsoft Purview, if you will, but leveraging the cybersecurity capabilities that's already baked in Office 365, Azure Active Directory, and even more Azure services and Defender, la-di-da, bringing all of those things together to support, my business critical applications. Email was great, OneDrive was great, SharePoint was great, Teams was great, but I still have these other apps that we use to drive our business. So we'll look at some different scenarios as we go through this. And if you're here today, you probably know this already, but we focus primarily, unapologetically on Microsoft Cloud Services. So of course, many of the scenarios that we're going to talk about here are going to be angled in that kind of direction. We don't really, we're not going to talk about other third-party components and services. And really it's because a lot of the customers that have made this investment want to know, how do I get the best use of the licensing I already have, or maybe extend it, and still part of that vendor consolidation, licensing management? Because, with every single product you buy, including the line of business applications you may purchase, has its own support contracts, training resources. But for those business apps, it's important to have. But really for the management security side, consolidating that makes things much, much easier. So let's dive into some of the really key things that you have to think of. And as we go through this, I'm going to bring up some, as we go through this, I'm going to talk about some of the key Azure services that kind of play along in this world. And then we're going to get specific on a few key applications in an environment, some different scenarios, and how to make decisions. And so this is one of the biggest areas that we say, well, we have these line of business applications, and but they're not all equal. Their architecture is a little bit different. Well, they access databases, but how do they access the database? Who connects to it? So for instance, for identity, if you have a local Active Directory, which many people do, and people access a line of business application that may be deployed on-premise, we're going to go again through some of those scenarios. When they log in, what's their username and password? Where is it stored? If it's provided by local Active Directory, then that's the place where the login happens. Some applications will actually store, here's a file, like who puts the username and password to the file. Some Linux applications, they'll still use this. So it's something to think about. It's always important questions. Doesn't happen nearly as much. One that does happen a lot is SQL. And it's not that it's the actual SQL login to MySQL or Microsoft SQL or Oracle, but it's that the username and password is in the SQL database. So when people log onto the site, they use that. So understanding for per application, where is the credential stored? Where is that validated is extremely important. We'll get to that. Second part is access. We have a line of business applications. People use it. How do they use it? Do they use a browser? That's how they connect to your specific server. Do they have a desktop, real desktop application that they run that executes on their local computer, that they once they go into it, however they authenticate, right? We've talked about that before, but that is the device that then connects to the server, because that's important to understand. Well, how does that desktop client connect to the other one? Is it via does it require VPN? Can it be done through a SSL based connection, or is it RPC based connection? Does it require local, line of sight to the server, that kind of world? We'll talk a little bit about that, because that impacts how we do the deployment, how we're going to handle the authentication. And again, many times, even if it's web or, and/or desktop client, does it require virtual private network, or do you have another way that you currently connect to it? Most times when we're talking about line of business applications and modernizing, it's pretty high chance that when remote people are out of the office, and in this kind of very more hybrid remote world that the pandemic has brought to us, there's oftentimes a VPN, people remoting in and they get to it. So that's the second part. How do they log in? How do people access that application? And then how do you deploy that application? Many times, even if it's a custom application or it's a commercial off the shelf, so you'll see COTS in here, commercial off the shelf software, you purchased it from somebody. There's an installer. Some IT person remote desktop into a server, double click on the installer, click on some buttons, configure things, and then it's done. Other applications, whether you bought it through a third party. Sometimes they have their updates through a method where it's literally copy and paste. Hey, there's a folder here. We made an update to something, and we get that code or we get that application, and we copy paste the new version someplace else. Very common. DevOps is another way, which kind of plays into all of these, if you will, where there's a little bit more automation. Now, sometimes people haven't really automated their line of business applications. It just hasn't been their priority, but they do check their source code in. They do have an application. More frequent or not than not, they will, that's where they'll do their testing and development, but then when they do their deployment, they will copy paste. I'll talk a little bit about how you can do that, even where you're on-prem. So many of these things, it doesn't matter if you're on-prem or running in a cloud instance someplace. These things all come into account. And the last part, licensing. Why are we talking about deployment? Well, there's a cost part of it. That's a part of licensing. But some applications have a tie into the license of the application, either because of the users or when you run into the installer. And so it is licensed for that server, which sometimes can add a little bit of friction in your migration plans, because you might lift and shift that server from on-prem into Azure, let's say, and when you put it in there, like, hey, it's all good, but the licensing component, some are pretty tricky this way, where the vendor is trying to protect their product and prevent you from deploying it in 3 different servers, because they might charge you for that. And so you weren't trying to be malicious in taking advantage of that. You were just trying to move it to another server, and that might cause an issue. Some things that you'd want to test out. So understanding, is the licensing component for this piece of software that we have, when we move it someplace, is that going to be an issue? All these things need to be part of the evaluation process with the vendor, understand what you have, and now we go forward. And then the last part really is around management. How do we today manage something? How could we in the future manage something, either using some of the Azure services that are there to track performance, do unified logging, which is extremely important for those in a compliant environment, where sometimes the challenge is in the existing environment is, scraping lots of different event logs. And oh, wait a minute, this application doesn't actually put it in the event logs. They put it into a separate SQL database. They write it to separate files. So understanding, how the login is done, what security, components are there in the application. All of these are important factors per application to identify what is the best approach as we move forward. We'll go through some of these scenarios, but I kind of think these are the top ones to kind of get you started, because as we look at what is it going to take to move a line of business application, if you can answer these high-end questions, then kind of understanding what the right approach to the next piece will make a key difference as you start to plan it out. And again, sometimes it could be an iteration. So you could start off with, we have this application and it's really on-prem today, and we're looking to really, take it to the cloud. Some things you really just can't do by yourself. It's a commercial off-the-shelf product, or it's something that we develop with somebody else. So you might have some limitations of, well, we can't really cloud native this thing because, well, we're not the vendor. That's what they have to do. But they do have, there might be infrastructure pieces that we could start to leverage. For example, we can take something, if we had an on-prem application, and say, we'll talk about some of these scenarios, and I'm going to take that into the cloud, and so I could use some infrastructure services that are there, such as, maybe I need to deploy this software in its own virtual machine. So I still have that, but the SQL database that it has, I could actually use the SQL service, so I don't have to patch, manage, update all of the SQL server running within a virtual machine. Instead, I can use the SQL service that Microsoft handles all the backups and patching and updates. I don't have to manage any of those things, and I get some cost, cost savings, not just because it might be a little bit cheaper, but the overhead to manage that, becomes cheaper because I don't have to manage it directly. If there's issues, got to get an alert and go get in there. So there could be flexibility. So understanding that you could make some of these transitions as you move along is important. Some of the applications that you might make, where these line of business applications, some of them, most of the times, I would say maybe 60% of the time, they're tools that you use internally, that to manage a project, to manage contracts, to manage inventory, whatever those things that you need to do to support the business. There are others where, hey, but these applications are ones that we have our customers log into, our partners log into. That's how we manage our supply chain. That's how we have them submit requests into us. So from that is not just a line of business application. It is part of your your product services. And if you are coding those things up or working with somebody, you may want to use even more cloud services from it to further, leverage the pieces that it has there. And again, that just might be one, but the other line of business apps are done differently. So there's kind of a matrix that goes in. But again, you kind of look at it application by application and thinking what you need to go do. And one thing when you look at Microsoft, Azure, is that it has so many pieces. And most of the times when you have line of business applications, and we're going to do the same thing here too, you tend to think of the server itself. Well, I have a server, it has a database server, and we have files. And I just want to maybe move into Azure because I don't want to rebuy hardware, or maybe I want to use some Azure pieces, but not all of it. Again, we'll go through some scenarios, but the one thing is that as you start to look at updates into the application we can do, looking into the available services that's inside of Azure is always a good kind of catalog to go take a look at. Then understanding the pricing, which I'll show a little bit later on as well towards the end, kind of help you make decisions of buy versus build or rebuild. And there's oftentimes when you're dealing with other developers or architects, they tend to lean on what they know. Which is like, oh, let's just install new SQL servers. It's like, wait a minute, do we really need that? Or can we use some SQL instances, especially because some of this is under development or staging, or we're doing light deployments or rollout. Let's leverage this and kind of push that a little bit more. You'll find that for some of those other developers, architects, once you kind of push that a little bit, they'll pull that in much faster if you're really open to it and ask the question. Anyhow, so there's a lot of servers that are out there. And again, as you go through this progression, some of it is, not just a lift and shift. Some of it is a new deployment. I have a line of business application. Should I just migrate the whole thing? Copy this VM, use an Azure Migrate that'll assess it and basically start to spin up a new copy, and I can test it, and then I can roll out my update. Or is this a place where I want to do a new deployment? What kind of deployment is that? We'll go through a couple scenarios. And then what could I change? You could migrate the application, complete lift and shift, and be fine. You could decide, I want to bring up an application and use some of the new platform services as well as some of the legacy infrastructure, and I'll go through that as well. So hopefully I'm trying to really push into here that there's no one way, but you should really look at per application, how it's deployed, what can we use, what are the benefits of it. We kind of wish it was just the easy button and just go. But then you may not get the right benefits from it. You may not get the cost savings from it. You may not get the efficiencies from it. And then you'll think, I thought this would be better, but I didn't. So, kind of the quick route may not be the best route. And there's a lot of good tools, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. Now, some of this might be, hey, there's some services that I have that are on-prem that I may want to keep managing on-prem, and some of it, so having this kind of hybrid approach. And again, this kind of think a little bit more local infrastructure. If you don't have local AD, which is very uncommon, if you have servers without any local AD, when you find that's normally a lot of data processing, custom applications, and maybe you're already in a cloud environment like Google or something, migrated to Microsoft 365, just never needed it. So that's fine. But in other scenarios, it might be, hey, well, we have these servers that we have on-prem that we're using for our line of business applications, but it does work with files, and we have some local SQL server. So can I still, do I have to do everything at once? No, you don't have to do it at once. And there's, definitely great tools to do it, and slowly kind of pull up the pieces that have the most impact that you can have in your business, and still kind of slowly moving things up into the cloud. So again, if you're thinking about migrating applications where, like, let's say you have something like SAP, which is a really good example, some ERP solution that's they're the vendor, they give you new builds, you buy licensing. And so for that one, I have on-prem, that process to move up into the cloud, it might be, again, this goes a little bit to licensing, it goes to process. Do I migrate as is that virtual machine from on-prem into the cloud, or do I do it as a part of a new deployment? And I'll go through that scenario. The other is that if you do have developers, whether they're full-time or they're contractors, that they build the software for you that really solves particular problems, that's a good line of business example. Many times, again, they're often going to rely on the coding capabilities that they know, right? They build something in .NET. They deploy to IIS on a Windows server. They do a copy-paste deployment. It gives you all the features that they want. But they often struggle with the other half of it on the cloud side of, hey, do you know you can get that same application deployed as as an application service? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. And like, well, wait a minute, do we support that or not? It's like, well, it's really just a Windows or a Linux server, and you're doing a copy paste deployment. This thing's built for that kind of thing. And now we don't have to have a server VM. We use application services, and I'll talk about that some more. So sometimes it might be, hey, we really like this developer, the things we're doing. Then you'd really, these are things that we do here at Agile IT, or you find somebody else, but really you should come here and work to kind of help connect the dots there and close the gap there. We're not a developer shop that, we're going to build your app and do those. We help other developers as well as IT people understand how to use those cloud services to their benefit to help them do better deployments and updates and really reduce the overall kind of IT costs and headaches of management and deployment. Anyway, so different routes that you can take in terms of migrate in pieces, migrate all, and or building what you have. So again, lift and shift has some of its benefits in terms of getting what you have, like against there's licensing restrictions, or do we do a rebuild? Some things, as you can see here, a little bit more tied to traditional IT services, like domain controllers don't like to be copy pasted and moved, but they're multi-masters. Have a VPN, migrate, have a connection. I'll show this in a second. The AD Connect server file servers, they don't like to be copy paste. There's other tools to do new deployments and migrations for that. I'm not going to talk about file servers, but again, something to keep considering. Should we bring up the whole thing, do it in pieces, or do a redeploy and configure? So with that kind of a setup, let's talk about some, where our starting point is and some scenarios that are application specific to get a little bit deeper and start to talk those things out. And some of these things I'm gonna, I'm on my little fancy Surface, what is this thing? Surface Designers, Studio laptop, and pull out my pen and do a little bit of drawing. Apologize in advance if it looks I'm not the best artist, but I draw a lot of things. Anyhow. So let's just take this as your starting point. You have, I have this business. It's Contoso, our favorite Microsoft fictitious name. And, we're already in Microsoft.com. We have Contoso.com as our email. And we even have an Azure subscription that's here. I'm not using it for anything. We have the same kind of Azure AD. Currently synchronizing it with Azure Active Directory connects our local Active Directory. So this is where we put all user accounts, our servers are connected into local Active Directory. Our desktops are connected to local Active Directory. Even our remote desktops go through VPN client remote Active Directory. So this is a very a common starting point for many organizations. Using lots of Office 365, we have this infrastructure on-prem. We have these four kind of line of business applications that we're going to talk about. And now again, our goal is we want to modernize them, think about our migrations, what are the different pieces that we would go through them. So as a starting point, we have these four applications. They have different types in terms of how they were purchased or created. So we have this commercial off-the-shelf support tickets. It's web-based. The authentication is application specific, which means that when one of our users logs in via the web to access these support tickets, we do with our customers or partners, and we just bought it, runs on a server. It's got a SQL Server backend, and when people log into it, they have to provide a username and passwords. Now, what application is this? We're not going to dive into, and you can, as I go through the scenarios, you might say, wait a minute, I think our application is like that. So hopefully, and maybe it's a variation. Anyway, so even in this one, support, Contoso company, we have 4 line of business applications that we have here. 2 were custom built that we did one ourselves. We had a contractor go do it. They're kind of targeted towards different scenarios. The authentication into them are there's 2 different types that we've used here. The support tickets and the ERP one is app specific, which means when you go into that application, the application is going to ask, hey, what's your username and password? Well, okay, we type that in, and it's going to check its database to see if it has that username and password. Not the greatest, but sometimes when you're modernizing, it's actually not bad of a start. I mean, I don't prefer to say build an application that way, but that's what they have. And then for the so for the support tickets and the ERP, those are pieces of software that we purchase, we license. The ERP one, still commercial off the shelf, it has a desktop application. So when people use this application, they have on their desktop, there's a little icon, they double click on it, it's an application installed on their local computer, it runs on their local computer, and that's where they log in, and then that's how they interact with it from that client. But the authentication is stored in the username and password that, in this case, we have an Oracle database that this is where it's all stored in. And there is an API that people can call in and access, but for the most part, the ERP people are just using it from the desktop. The inventory and HR one, both web-based, one's .NET, one's Java, they both leverage local Active Directory. They also have a SQL database and use file shares to store data. And this is common. You have applications that store everything in a database, and sometimes they mix it up. They'll put things into a database as well as a file share because of maybe there's large images and maybe that you're doing maybe some some other kind of application that wants to store a large amount of files, but like the file tracking and who uses it, all that's stored in a database. So whatever the application is or how the developers and architects decided to define it, this is kind of the breakdown. So let's go into one and talk a little bit about it. So here we have the support tickets. Now, when we think about the authentication of applications, we think about a user that essentially starts here, and they open up a browser and they're going to get in. Well, the first thing that really happens is whenever a Windows 10 or Windows 11, and here we're saying it's tied to local Active Directory, whenever the computer turns on, the first thing that happens is that the client itself wants to authenticate. Hey, local AD, it's me. And said, yeah, I know who you are. So then the user goes in to log into this desktop and says, hey, I'm the user. Good, let's just double check. Yep, you are who you are too. I trust the device. I trust the user. We're good. User opens up a browser, right? They open up a browser and they access the application. Well, this particular application, in this one, it's tied to the username and password, right? Well, why did I talk about the first one? Well, it's important because people did log onto a desktop. It is local AD. But now when they access the application web-based, the application itself is going to say, okay, well, it's, I talked to this SQL database and hey, does that username and password pan out? Yes, it does. Great. Welcome into the application. But here's the place where people tend to get a little lost on something extremely important in terms of an inventory and knowing your application is that the application here, so let me do this real quick. Oops, didn't mean to do that, but yeah, so the application over here, how do I get out of that thing? There we go. So the application over here runs under a specific context. What that means is that this application that's running here on an IS process runs under an account that's also in local AD. And when this application runs its process and connects to this database, it can do it in one of two ways. It can do it based off of the Windows login, see my terrible writing, or the SQL login. In this case, it's a SQL login. So this application runs under a process that's a local AD process. It sees a person comes in, doesn't care about their authentication because it checks against the database. And when it does connect to the database, this application, it uses the SQL login. So in this case, what identities did we have? We had the device, the user, the server process, and the SQL login. So one app, 4 different identities. Do we care about the device identity? You bet, because later on we think about as we transition applications, are the desktops in the future also local AD based, or are they now all Azure AD based? So now we have to take that into account. Anyhow, so this is kind of the way the application is set today. So let's think about our strategy here. Well, in this particular example, we're going to say, let's just keep the application username and password the same, just as we get started for this. But now we still want to make this application available to other people. So we're going to use something called Azure Active Directory App Proxy or Application Proxy. It requires putting an agent on, in your environment. Do you put on the same server, different server? You normally want to put it in a different server. And now you can still publish that on-premise environment without a virtual network. When people will log in, they will see it in their application, myapps.microsoft.com. They can click on that. And then through the proxy, Azure Active Directory is going to work with that agent. It will now route to that application. So one, well, we didn't change the username and password. True, but in order to get to that application and go through the app proxy, they have to fulfill your MFA and conditional access policies and who you assign that application to. So now in Azure AD, I can say, hey, we have that application, our support tickets. We're now going to make it available through Azure Active Directory. We can say who has access through it through Azure Active Directory, how they're allowed to access it. They have to have a compliant environment. They only have to be in the locations that we approve of. Whatever you put for your conditional access policies, now that they fulfill that, it will route it on-prem. Well, when they get there, they still have to do username and password. There's ways to kind of work around that. But let's say they still did it. I still now made it without a VPN, had more controls around it, accessing on-prem. Well, but kind of maybe I want to lift and shift it. True. But in this one, we're going to say we're going to leave it on-prem. I've modernized my authentication. I may decide to migrate it up into Azure later on, still continue to do app proxy until maybe I take one of the next steps, like the other applications I'll talk about later. So now I have this way of controlling access to it, controlling who gets access to it. But what about the server itself? Well, now I can use things like this on the server. So Azure Arc allows you to essentially see servers that are not in Azure. It could be AWS, it could be on-prem, Colo, wherever you want. And now you can see it and apply policies from one place in Azure. I can now use update management through Azure Automation, even though it's still on-prem. And at this point, I still don't need a VPN between Azure and on-prem. So now I can update it, see inventory, apply policies, create schedule rules, schedule tasks, and I can collect logs using Azure Log Analytics, which will pull important information such as performance, specific event logs, like, hey, every time this application, we bought a commercial off the shelf, and every time it has issues, it throws, some error in the event log. You can pull that in, see it across all your applications in one location. Maybe I want to track who logs into that application onto that server. Same thing. So just for this one application, we haven't moved it. We now can provide better security and control through it, and we can start to manage it without a VPN using the cloud service that they start. Modernize it a little bit. I'm kind of preparing for migration in the future, but this one, we're not going to migrate, but we did modernize it. So that's this specific application. And I thought I had, okay, that specific application, that was our approach. So now the next one here is our inventory application. Now the inventory application is a little bit different. In this one, still same thing. The first thing the computer turns on, it authenticates. A user comes on and it authenticates as well. Same as we did before, user, client, we're all good. The difference in this one is that the inventory application itself wants to use local Active Directory for authentication. It doesn't store it in a username and password in the SQL database. It wants to trust the identity management of local Active Directory on the Windows server to fulfill, is this who it is? So in this particular example, same thing, went through there, we know the user, know the device. Now they have the web browser, goes to the server. And in this case, this is, where we make the assumption here that it's going to use NTLM, or let's say Kerberos-based authentication, which is ticket-based. So this person logged in, it actually does a different routing, but for the sake of this demo, we'll make it easier. And now we just validate, is this person and device say who they are? Yes, they are. Perfect. Now that happens, I know who it is. In terms of managing the user preferences, their lists, all those sorts of things, you can take like on-prem SharePoint as a good example, or some other application where it says, well, now I know who it is, in terms of what they can access, the list that they're working on, the rules, whatever in my application. I really store all that into a SQL database. And then if there's any big files that they're working on, they've uploaded it, I put it into a file server. Now, what's interesting here is, just like last time we talked about, I have an identity for the client, an identity for the user. The server process also runs into identity. In this case, when the server process accesses the SQL server, it's going to use the SQL username password that has stuffed in the connection string. But because this application also stores files, and it's going to put it onto a file server that's, let's say, on a different server, the file access to that server is going to be based off of the process of the application. So this process of the application probably has read-write permissions on some share on a server, right? So, and it's able to go from server to server like this because this process of the application also has an identity, right? So it's, app server, something. So app server 1 is the name of the process in Active Directory. That's what this this application runs under inside of IIS. Like that's the context that it runs under, and that's how it accesses files and does everything on this file server. So now we have different identities. We still have the one that's here, the one that's in SQL, the connection string, the process, the user. So lots of different authentication and access rules. So again, knowing the application, how does it access it? Because oftentimes, like, oh, users go through this to the SQL database, which you could. You could not decide to have a straight connection string, and then when a user logs in, because this is all Kerberos space, that it's the actual user context of the user here. It's how it's accessed in the SQL database. You don't see this often. I mean, it's good actual architecture. You don't see in a lot of custom applications. A little harder to do, understanding to do delegated or impersonation, authentication, cross boxes, and depending on how many boxes you go through, you got to do all kinds of crazy nonsense around that. But you could do that, and if you did, now you have to understand, how that jumps. Why is this important? Well, as we start to think about this application, and in this particular example, we actually want to take this application, we code it up, we understand our pieces. Now what we're going to do is we're going to change it to where the authentication is Azure Active Directory based. Remember, right now we're already syncing with Azure Active Directory. Our local AD accounts that we have, and let's just say that's all of our users get synchronized with Azure Active Directory, so they're already there. The application code that we have now, well, we kind of needed to understand the authentication around Azure Active Directory. In this particular example, it was a .NET application that we have. We're going to update right now the code when it runs, it just automatically inherits the identity. So we got to do a little bit of coding updates in there to say, hey, I need to be able to access Azure Active Directory to validate login and control what that is. And to do that, depending on what version of .NET, it doesn't really matter if it was web forms or you're doing .NET Core, different paths. You have to do that. Anyway, you want to tell the application how to authenticate things and pass that along. But because you do that and you have that code, once that authentication happens, which again, once you have that, you can make an enterprise app, control who gets there, follow your MFA policies, and have a little bit tighter control with Azure AD and in the application. But you don't have to go all the way. In the beginning, you say, we're going to update the application so it understands how to talk to Azure Directory a little bit easier. And then now that we have this, it was a simple .NET application, ASP.NET based, and we did a copy-based deployment because we coded it, and that's how we did it. Instead of putting that on a virtual machine, we're going to deploy that as an app service, which we can run on Windows or IIS, much lighter. Again, in this scenario, I don't, I as the developer and as the customer, I don't have to do manage it like a server, update management, have remote desktop into it. People go into it. Like, we don't need to do that. We can actually push updates. We can use automated fashions. And so now I'm using Azure SQL Server and app service. I can do things like Azure Insights and log analytics. Some of these things you're seeing that are similar from the other approach that we had, but some new tooling because I'm putting in the application itself, all so that I can make this available. So what changes for the users? Well, in this particular case, we can improve things not only from our infrastructure management standpoint, but for them, they would still see an app registration, or they would still see it in My Apps, and they could click on it and see the application. How is that different from the support tickets? Well, the support tickets always has me do username and password. It just access it different. This one, when I go to access it, where today I may open up a browser, go into it, and I don't need to put in any username and password because I'm local AD, but I have to VPN into this. Here, I wouldn't have to do it. I have the same single sign-on with Azure Active Directory, the same controls. So IT is probably going to get the most out of this, and for the user, probably not feel as much, but that's a good thing. But now it's but what about their passwords? Same passwords they have on local AD that they have in Azure AD, Office 365. So it kind of fulfills some of those scenarios. And when you look at the app service for an application, we're going from copy pasting remote desktop into a server, pasting things in there. We can actually post things into an app service where when we put our application in there, we do these things called slots. I'm not going to get too much in the details of this, but essentially I can say I'm going to do a deployment into a staging location. Hey, that works out pretty good. Let's go ahead and move to production. Normally when people hear this, it's like, oh, I deploy to production. No, you go to stage and you go, we're going to switch this to production. And you basically say, change them. So now what's in production or what was in stage, it just flips to production. That's all. It's just routing. And if something goes wrong, you can say, I want to go to the last good one. So all this kind of reinstalled, stall to deploy kind of goes away for the same application that you had already. This would work the same way if you were doing a LAMP stack, you're doing Java on a Linux box, you're doing .NET code deployed to Linux that's running this app service. All of these things play in the same way. And so, moving to this, it's much easier to do than most developers and customers think, but it should be on your strategy to look at that. Well, we'll improve on this later. If you're going to move, it's, again, something to assess that you can go do. Some customers may have built things on-prem with Kubernetes, and you've created these containers. And so to make things easier to move, but you really haven't moved it up there. So it's really, if you've already done that or kind of taken that approach and put in Kubernetes and these different containers, migrating that up to Azure is much simpler because you're kind of these container pods, and it allows you to even start leveraging other infrastructure services that you either couldn't afford yet, didn't want to pay for, they're hard to manage in terms of having better load balancing, multiple firewalls or scanners and all those things, and that's a big part of that the cloud gives you. So making that move to kind of migrate it up, whether it's a copy paste migration, an Azure migrate, containerization, it doesn't matter. You can start to leverage these other cloud pieces that, again, sometimes were difficult to get and deploy and understand. We're here now, you can really do that. And then lastly, as we look at our applications, whether it's .NET or it's Java, here's where we're doing the deployments. It could be an Azure virtual machine. You may say, well, we can't support doing this as an app server, or we're just not ready to take that on, but we want to move a little faster. Then yes, you can still put things into Azure as virtual machines, but instead of saying, well, let's create it and go through the portal, clickety click click, or let's go ahead and deploy a new environment, and even if I PowerShell to do ARM templates, well, it's still very manual, and you don't capture the logic where you could do something that's in Azure DevOps, or you can do something in GitHub, where you can essentially focus on, how do we do the deployment? Well, why would you invest in that? We want to spend more time on our application. It's the repeatability of it, which is good, and the other is the logic to support when people transition within the business or out of the business, you lose that logic of how to deploy and how to deploy, where this you get to have as part of your kind of built-in framework. And still, this could be a part of the way that you do your new deployment, even before, you make a lot of changes. So keep that in mind as you go through it, even as a part, especially if you're going to do hey, let's not just do a copy paste of the virtual machine. We're going to do rebuild. Well, if I can build the first and second one, even as I test them and change them, and do it a little bit of an automated process, well, if I needed to change it again and again and again, I don't have to say like, hey, did we write all that stuff down? Who knows how to click on these things? You essentially rerun the pipeline process to automate what you want. So again, something to consider early and often. Okay, the human resources one, I'm not going to go through this that much because it's essentially the same thing, except that it's Java. And the reason why I wanted to call out, essentially the same thing is because in a Java application, we can do the same things, whether .NET, Java, Linux, Windows. The Azure platform is really, really nice. But the one thing that is different in the human resources one is that right now it was running based off of local Active Directory, but in the version that the customer has that we're going to migrate, it actually supports Azure Active Directory via single sign-on or SAML-based authentication. So this is a really good thing where we're gonna do a lift. We are gonna do an Azure migrate. We're gonna copy those VMs. We're gonna put it up into Azure. Same thing with the SQL Server. For some reason, this vendor doesn't really like or can't support, or if there's some limitation, they can't not do Azure SQL or MySQL, any Azure service. So they need to run the database service for performance reasons or whatever as a virtual machine. No problem. So we migrate those things that are up there. But now when people authenticate it, we're gonna update the application because it does support it now, and it's going to do single sign-on through Azure Active Directory. You might already be doing this with other applications like HubSpot or Salesforce or whatever else out there, and now your own application can do the same thing. They may not say, oh, we know how to do Azure Active Directory. So they say, oh, it doesn't work. So you got to ask, can you do SSO through SAML or something like OAuth? Yes, good. So we can migrate it up, change authentications. Now we get all the advantages, compliance, conditional access, all those things. But because they're virtual machines running in there, I can still leverage the same tools. Remember, in some of these scenarios, some of those servers are still on-prem. Some of them are using Azure services. And in this case, they're also running as VMs running in Azure, but I'm still doing log analytics, do the same things. I'm still doing the same automation. So you can see here where even though I'm deployed in different ways in different locations, from a cost perspective, training perspective, support perspective, I'm leveraging many of the same tools, which means I'm going to save money in the education for my team or the vendors that I work with. the knowledge on how to do it. So all of those pieces come together. Again, when you're thinking about moving line of business applications, these are all important aspects, to go through. And if this application was a larger, complex application, and that you may want to or could, and a lot of times you'll see these diagrams specific from the vendor that says, oh, because this is not 5 years ago or 10 years ago, they pretty much have architecture and deployments for Azure, and they'll tell you how to handle this. So if you have a large organization and they could support the load balance, kind of more complicated environment, you could do this. I will tell you that if you were going to go to an architecture like this, the first order of business I would do is not only understand what this architecture, but how to automate this, because you would think, well, I don't want to automate. We're only going to do one time. That is never true, because as you start to do the deployments, you're going to test it, retest it. Things are going to go down, update. You are going to go through this environment and redeploy in whole parts or in small sections frequently. So automating from the beginning, understand how to do it, you'll think is a big cost, but it actually saves a lot of cost and heartache and meeting times and understanding and frustration, over a course of, a few years. So, really keep that in mind as you go through. Okay, last one here for the scenario. So the ERP, this one's different because we have a client desktop. So right now, when users connect into the ERP solution, they have a client desktop, they open it up, they log in. That login is application stored, so it's in their SQL database that's stored there. But how do people access this? This is the biggest one that we look at, because oftentimes, in order for this to work, a lot of times there's a VPN if you're remote, or it's in the office, just to make this application. And again, the thing that I said the most is when this accesses it, what port are they using? What identity services are they requiring? Does it log into AD directly? This one doesn't. That's nice, but it does go through a specific port that is going to require a not just one port number. It might have 100 that it goes through, 100 different ports, because they have because that's just what they do. I can't tell you most of the times, because it's the range that they have, and they're doing something more of a binary call that's not as light as web calls like SSL and HTTPS. So understanding that tells us, well, is there a way to configure it to reduce it down? No, we still need to do a VPN. Okay, that's fine. But now let's do the VPN through Azure so that it can offload what we do in the office. So I might still have that, might still configure it that way, but I got to do a little bit different. So really, it's the client piece that you really have to take a look at with the ports. I know I'm running out of time. I'm almost there. Just wanted to keep kind of set that example that when you're doing the ERP or something like that, and it has a client desktop, again, it's how does that client on the desktop not only get there, that's Intune and all that crazy stuff, but how does it talk to the server? What ports does it have? Is it a binary like RPC, or is it HTTPS, HTTPS? Well, now that's much different, because we can use all the advantage of the modern web to do that with the firewalls. If it needs something that's more RPC based, or something that we know local ISPs block, well, now we have to think about VPN, or how can we wrap it, or do we do app proxy? So again, who are the people? How do they connect and access? What are those things? So here's again another example where this is like an ERP system where we have external users that may need to access through it. And so for here, we might, for this specific deployment, we might use something like the app proxy again, or we say we really don't need it because that client to desktop uses HTTPS. But now we have to look at, does a client or that server understand how to handle SAML-based authentication, or can we put something else in there to configure it? So again, understanding the application is going to be important. Now, here's an architecture that you look at where we have things in Office 365. We have our devices like we were just talking about that's protecting things on the public internet. We have servers that we have on-prem. We have servers in the cloud. We have a lot of stuff that's happening here. But the nice thing is that all of my authentication, compliance, compliance access, application access, logging, I'm pulling all that together into log analytics. I'm leveraging Azure Sentinel so it can get the signals for all of those things that are happening, both in the environment, outside, in VMs, to help when there's attacks or threats that are happening. It can detect a pattern across all of those endpoints. Because it's no good when you get hacked into a server and go, well, we'll manage that through Sentinel, but yeah, we don't pull any of the application information or VPN information. So you have a limit of signals that goes into Sentinel that could have told you the pattern or detected the pattern earlier. So again, the benefit of pulling all of those pieces again. And the applications themselves, whether you've modernized it, left it on-prem, modernized it, migrated, put it in Azure, you still want to have that combination of oversight management, which Azure provides, but even more so on the security and compliance connections that you have. Okay, last thing I wanted to go through here is we talk about pricing. So this is one that I think is a really important one, not talked about often enough. So if you go to that Azure pricing calculator, so you saw the link that was there. Okay, let's log in again. Hopefully it's not going to do the whole thing. Let me just log in real quick here. I'll pump back to the screen here in a second. Sorry about that. Okay. So when you get into the pricing calculator, one of the things that you would have seen on top, but is you'll see a link to log in. You see sign in here, but there'll be some text at the bottom to enter to log in. Do that one. Now here you can see my info. You can send me an email if you're interested or whatever, and you'll have yours. Now, why would you do this? Why is this so important? So if you're going to price something out, like we're talking about like virtual machines. So let's go ahead and click on a virtual machine. You do this, puts a little calculator, put a little thing to the side and saying like, hey, we added it. And here you can put some databases and whatever else. As you start to select those, they'll go to the bottom section over here on the screen. It's doing it. Apologies, it's taking too long. But when you start to add those items in here, one is you get to, here we go. You get to name this. So I can say this is the line of business webinar. And say like, that's good. And I already have some things like storage accounts, virtual machines in here. But why would I do it this way? Well, let's say, for example, I just added that virtual machine in here. And I'm going to call this virtual machine, let's say inventory app. Let's say I was going to do that one. Oh, no, sorry, ERP servers. And, those ERP servers, West Coast, Windows, OS only. We'll do a SQL server later. I'm going to do it for the month, run it all month. And you can do different prices that are in here. And as you're doing pricing, especially for VMs, if you're going to have a line of business application servers, you pretty much turn them on and leave them on forever. Well, for as long as you run them. But when you first start out, you're going to do pay as you go because you want to kind of figure out what's the right performance metrics. What's the right size of VM, how many cores and memory rounds, lots of options. Test it out. Once you land on one like, hey, this is good, I think this is what we can run. Then you can save money by saying like, hey, yeah, we're going to pretty much say we're going to run it for a year or 3 years. So we get a pretty good discount and take that into the account for your pricing. In the beginning, for your first several months, you're not going to do that because you might pick the wrong thing and it's a big headache. So now you have one, now you have this price. You manage disks because we store things on the application, but if maybe it's a lightweight application, you don't need it, like it's fine. But because it's our ERP server and we do need to put it on faster disks, with a little bit more performance, and I might have, multiple of these disks, per server, we get to this price. So great, monthly price this, you see this because of the other blob storage stuff I have or whatever. But now this is the price. So the last part I want to talk about here is that we've priced something out, we've added more servers. Even here, I could say, well, good, we have the line of business servers, but I do want to add another VM. So this we're going to have 2 of those virtual servers. You'll see here that it's named. This one's going to be the SQL server, ERP prod. And so now that we have that, I need to make sure it has SQL on there because I'm going to run run it with that. And I'm going to do standard to save me some money. This comes with the SQL license. So, do I have to do the SQL cows? No, because this comes with it. Do I have to pay for the SQL license of the server? No, because this comes with it. That's why it costs more money. I'm going to do a 3-year thing on this. And so now here's what my price was. So I did a few of these servers, both for dev, testing, whatever. And now I can save it. So remember, a line of business webinar, yep, I want to save that one. And not only that, sometime today it'll do its thing. Not only that, if it doesn't get there, here you'll see a share. Thank you. So now I can share this. It'll give me a link. There we go. It'll give me a link that I can send to any one of you. Once you get this link, if you copy, paste it, and type it in, enjoy, you're going to get the same thing that I created estimates for. But when you save it, it's not going to be this thing. So we're not collaborating on it, but you get to see it and do it. So it's really great to price things out, keep it. You can export it to a spreadsheet, send it to other people, make those changes. So when you're thinking about, well, what is it going to cost for these types of things when I'm going to migrate the VMs, or if I'm going to have SQL or SQL services, this is not going to be super spot on because there's a lot of little things you don't know yet. How much traffic, how busy are your applications when they talk to each other? So there's still a lot of things to figure out, but it does give you good high level pricing estimates. Then you can save it, share with other people, then evaluate it as you go along. So understanding how to migrate, what are the things to take a look at, and then how do I possibly price that out, maintain it, because if you went through this the first time, did all that work, and then didn't save it, man, what a headache that is. So that's why I always bring it up. So, really, hopefully after you walk out of here today, and I appreciate your time, again, just kind of going over modernization, you can do some of it in place. You can modernize, as a part of a migration. You can migrate things and not even modernize it because you're going to do it on VPN and still do local AD. And, so there's a lot of options you can go through it. But really the big thing to look at is remember those areas that I said from an application of inventory: identity, access, deployment, and management. How do we do that today? Let's think about the ways we can do it tomorrow. And the leap from that is really not such a we're going to put it off. The longer you put it off, it tends to be more complicated because you might get it on an older server. You might have something that's not working anymore, but you can do it in pieces. Modernize in place is a good start. Modernizing as you're doing a migration. You might take one application, modernize it in place, and then migrate it, and then modernize it again. So it's a journey with your applications, and it's important to keep that rhythm going because the one thing that hurts all IT organizations, all business applications, and not business apps is technical debt. Because sometimes the application to move from where you want to where you want to be, especially if it's a commercial off-the-shelf thing, they'll say, well, you're going to have to make 2 migrations. We've seen that as an exchange server migrations. You're going to have to migrate once, and then you can migrate to the cloud. So really take a look at that and prioritize that. Using the, and again, you don't have to pick one way for all your applications. It's a big mistake. Just lift and shift all of them. Again, you may not get best at the application. It may cost you more money in the transition. It may cost you more money in where it's deployed. So one at a time going through that, which is the best one. People say, well, do low-hanging fruit. I mean, I guess you could do that. Things are quick and easy if you're going to learn something. Sometimes picking the a little bit more complicated, not the one that's going to take you 2 years to do. So a lot of times it will show you all of the other pieces that are issues that you can then use for the other applications. So we'd be more than happy to talk to you here at Agile IT, and go through it. Thanks for taking this time. Hopefully it answers at least not so much how to do your application, but how to assess your application and maybe give us a call and we can help you out. So with that, thank you for your time. Sean, any other questions? I think I'm pretty much out.
No, I've gone ahead and I put a link to our Contact Us page on our website. I do know that we've gone short on time. Thank you very much to everybody who's joined. There is a question that I will answer right now. There will be copies of this presentation. I will send that out to everybody who's attended and registered, probably on Monday. And other than that, thank you very much, Conrad. This was a lot to take in, but very thorough, and I really appreciated it.
Awesome. Thank you.